When I said that employees, well, the research shows that they're not getting enough room to grow, what does this mean? They don't have the room to grow, that employers perhaps aren't providing people enough growth opportunities.
When we think about what opportunities for growth actually look like, I think there's a few different levers that we have. I think the traditional one people often have top of mind as I move from like a junior to a senior to a manager to director potentially. And I think that track of actually becoming a people leader might not necessarily even be the right one for everyone. I think we also need to move away from thinking there's like one specific box that everyone needs to fit in. And I think that goes to your theme of personalization. So what are the specific skills, potential interests that a person brings? And then crafting very personalized opportunities for that person to actually expand their learning, have the right stretch projects, expand their role in certain ways that are crafted right for this person.
You are listening to Personalization Outbreak, a podcast about the collapse of traditional corporate standards in today's more personalized world. I'm Llopis. I'm a leadership strategist, author, contributor to Forbes, and founder of the Leadership in the Age of Personalization movement. On this show, I'm interviewing executives across multiple sectors to find out how the balance between standardization and personalization can exist. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Personalization Outbreak Podcast. Did you know that more employees than ever are looking to leave their jobs? And I'm talking about leaving them today, more than they did during the Great Resignation. In fact, there's a new study out from LinkedIn and Microsoft that actually shows that almost half of the workforce of their workers today, 46% to be exact, are considering leaving their job within the next year. So what's the top reason? What's going on here? The lack of room for growth. So simple, but maybe not so simple. And to be with us today to help us figure all this out and why employers are just not creating enough growth opportunities for their employees is our special guest, Jenny Podewils, co-CEO of Leapsome, the intelligent people platform. I like that empowers managers with the right tools and insights to develop, align, and engage their teams. So before we get started, please click the like button below, share it with your colleagues, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and social media at Llopis. Jenny, great to have you on the show. I loved our initial conversation last week. Thanks for being here.
Yes, really excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited too. I mean, let's face it, Jenny, the work that you're doing is very relevant. It's very important. So maybe you could frame something for me through your own lens. When I said that employees, well, the research shows that they're not getting enough room to grow, what does this mean? They don't have the room to grow, that employers perhaps aren't providing people enough growth opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question to dive deeper into. And I think what we've seen across many industries over the past few years, a couple of years, is that we've hit a bit of a tougher environment in the market. So if we take, for example, professional services and technology companies that we also partner with a lot, we've seen that a lot of the growth momentum from the previous years is just maybe not as present anymore as it was before. And I think we've gotten a bit maybe lazy in being more intentional in creating growth opportunities. It was much easier to actually create new growth opportunities as companies were growing really, really fast. And there was automatically new opportunities opening up for new managers, for new experts, just as the workforce in these companies was expanding. And I think when we think about what growth, like what opportunities for growth actually look like, I think there's a few different levers that we have. I think the traditional one people often have top of mind as I move from like a junior to a senior to a manager to director potentially. And I think that's one opportunity to see growth. And I think that track of actually becoming a people leader might not necessarily even be the right one for everyone. Other opportunities really for growth are expanding your skills, like expanding your capabilities, being able to work on potentially stretch opportunities that really help you to become a more rounded individual or in the workspace. And I think this is actually where there are potentially interesting opportunities. Maybe also like if a team is becoming leaner, maybe there's new opportunities to take on more responsibility, to grow in that, to have new experiences that you can really thrive from. And I think the final thought I have is I think we also need to move away from thinking there's like one specific box that everyone needs to fit in. And I think that goes to your theme of personalization, and think a lot more about role crafting. So what are the specific skills, potential interests that a person brings, and then crafting very personalized opportunities for that person to actually expand their learning, have the right stretch projects, expand their role in certain ways that are crafted right for this person.
So let's go back to something you mentioned about momentum. Oftentimes, the work that you do and even I do, one might think, okay, they went through the program, they went through all these learnings, they did all these assessments. But given the world that is becoming more and more personalized, is it safe to say that there's never an end to the work? Because this is what standardization thinks, that once they've been there and they've done the work, that it's over. Why is that not the case, unless, of course, you feel otherwise?
I mean, I think we have to acknowledge we also are living at a time when technological progress has really accelerated. So if we look at sort of like the exponential growth curve of different technologies, like massive innovations are actually happening at a much faster pace. And also technologies are advancing at a much faster pace. So learning and lifelong learning and constant learning, I think, are part of our reality nowadays. And I think ultimately the question is like, what does that ultimately mean? Like, and there's an element of more formal learning, right? We do manager training programs. We do training programs potentially now on AI for people to understand what AI is, how to interact with it, how to prompt it effectively. So all of that is formal learning, but a much larger share of ultimately leading to growth and leading to ultimate learning is actually happening on the job. And I think this is why there always needs to be an interplay of both sort of like the training programs, the impulses we set, the role modeling we demonstrate as leaders, but then also the opportunities we create for folks to really then apply these new learnings further expand upon them. And I think AI is an interesting opportunity to look at. So for example, you can do an impulse training on AI, but I think what's really, really important is then building the habits. So for example, whenever you were kind of ready to Google something, I think an interesting challenge for oneself or to also put out to your team is like put that into like ChatGPT or another large language model and actually experience or experiment with when that actually gives you a better result, a good answer. And I mean, that's a really, really important new skill we're all learning in real time as the technology advances really, really fast. And I think these are little ways how we can make generate really growth opportunities also in the current times. And I think where lifelong learning really becomes part of or should become part of our habits.
So speaking of habits, Jenny, what do you think has been the driving force in how the role of employees has started to move from cost center mentality, the standardization mentality, to now consumers and personalization?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's an interesting development we've seen, especially in the sphere of HR, moving away maybe from the traditional cost center, very compliance-based organization to one that's really becoming a true partner to the business, or even more like as a next step, maybe even a value driver for the business, which I think is like an interesting potential further evolution of the function. And if we look at what's been driving that, I think some of the driving force has been a shift in the workforce. So we have more than half of the workforce now being made up by millennials. So that's been a massive demographic shift. It's a part of the population that, to some extent, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, had a lot of the more basic needs met, and there's a lot more focus on self-actualization, purpose, like what do I really want to do, but also like just being maybe able to choose more in the job market. I think we've seen that shift from like a employer's market to a candidate market. So that ultimately had companies and also HR departments in particular to really rethink what is actually my value proposition to candidates, to employees. And it's been a bit of a shift in power dynamics triggered by both a demographic shift, but also like a shift in the job market.
Well, when you think about power shift, this was what just naturally came to mind. The shift of having a 25-year tenure, thinking that this is the way we've always done things. And then now, as you said, this emergence of the millennial population that feels less than because they have to assimilate to what the 25-year person that has all this tenure, but may be completely irrelevant in their thinking in solving our most pressing challenges and opportunities. When does the balance of power shift away from thinking generationally and more to people's capabilities and aligning them to what really matters to the business?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I think we very much see that the focus of like people teams or HR teams increasingly really becomes of what's the business sort of strategy, what's the objectives of the business, and how can I actually, as a people team, truly support them? So like really becoming that partner to the business. And I think at that point, like we don't necessarily even see there's a conflict in power. I think everyone ultimately is working to some extent towards the same goal, right? If I have a business strategy that I want to execute, I ultimately need to make sure that my workforce is highly aligned and marching to the same tune to help me actually execute that strategy, right? So I think there's a potential to actually have that synergy because between people want to understand the bigger picture. They want to contribute to the bigger picture. But if I actually give my workforce a better understanding as to where we're going, then we can also make sure that we're actually really marching together into the same tune, right? So I think it's actually something where I think there's a lot of synergies for business. Maybe in addition to, do we have strategic alignment? Does everyone have enough context to actually take good decision as decentral as they are? If we think about managers, for example, I think the manager job has become increasingly intense and stressful, also like driven through the pandemic and hybrid, and that having brought additional responsibility. There's some studies that actually show managerial responsibility have sort of like 2x in terms of complexity. And now if I think about it as a business, as a CEO, like the managers are actually, or as a people leader, the managers are a really, really important extension of my strategy. They actually help me to make the business initiatives land in the field. They're gathering data from the front line that I need to actually inform my strategy as a people manager or as a people leader. If I come up with people programs, initiatives, like I often cannot really execute them without really getting the managers bought in and as my extension. So I think if we think about it, there's a lot of synergy that actually exists. So I think the shift started with a power conflict, but if we really think about what's both best for the people, but also best for the business, I think there's also a lot of opportunity to actually see the synergies and really build upon them.
You know, it's interesting because as I hear you, what immediately comes to mind is, okay, where do we start? With the individual, the environment, or both? Because alignment really begins, just as a thought, with both. Because we've made so much effort in focusing on people, and it's great. But I oftentimes wonder, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, that maybe we spend too much time on that and not enough on the environment. And then what we only get is just a portion of what we wanted to get from the individual because they come back to the environment and boom, they run into it head on. I mean, what's the importance of how we shape environments so that we can find the right alignment between business growth strategies and employee capabilities? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think there was a question you asked me in the preparation to the call, and you said like you speak so much about people enablement. And what does that ultimately mean? And I think it's
Yeah.
very much linked to that question you're also raising of is it about the people? Is it about the business success? Or where do these two sort of intersect? And I think ultimately, if we speak about people enablement, and they were also making the business successful, I believe there's three fundamental drivers that we need to tackle and be strategic and intentional about getting right. The first one is the alignment part that we spoke about. Do people understand what our strategy is, where we're going, and what also is expected of them, and what their part is in ultimately moving that strategy forward? So that's the alignment piece. We already spoke about that. The second piece is sort of to your question, do we actually have an environment in which people can succeed? And how do we know if we have an environment where people can succeed? Do we survey our workforce? Do we understand what's going well, where we're moving in the right direction, where we're moving in the wrong direction? Like really having hard data and not just also like listening to those screaming the loudest. And that really helps us to be intentional about building that environment where success can actually happen, where people can do their best work. And then the third part is maybe focusing on people in the narrower sense and really having a good employee experience, which ultimately, again, I think is also in the best interest of the company. So do we have, when we start onboarding someone, do we generate clarity of what's expected of them straight in the beginning? Do they have all the equipment they need? Do they have all the information they need? Do they have clarity on the next steps? Once that's clear after the onboarding, do we have clarity on the goals, on the deliverables, on what's expected for the next period of time? Do we have a close feedback loop, right? A good performance management process, but also ongoing feedback? Do we work to establish that feedback culture where we have like the hard conversations early on to then course correct? So that's all part of the employee experience. Do we also then provide the right training, the right stretch opportunity so that growth we spoke about can actually happen? And how do we really invest into our managers to make them successful? Because again, they're the extension of your business strategy, they're the extension of your people strategy, and they have a really, really tough job these days, often without all the support they need. And I mean, ultimately, these factors then in combination really help to build that environment in which people can do their best work and really move the business forward.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about environment. Okay, you believe that employees can shape their own experience. With that in mind, what should employers do to provide an environment that actually accounts for what matters to their employees?
Yeah. And I think it's there's no like one size fits all answer on that. So it's also very much the theme of personalization. And I think that really starts with having good mechanisms to listen to your employees and gather the relevant data. So part of what we do from like a product and technology perspective is, for example, we have employee engagement survey tools, pulse survey tools that actually really help to get a good understanding and also like check that over time of what works well and just what doesn't work well. And I think there's really, really interesting insights both in the quantitative data, but also in the qualitative data, right? And we, for example, have AI capabilities. So all the qualitative data, all the comments you get from your employees are also analyzed at scale. And then you have a really interesting holistic picture from both the quantitative surveying, but also the qualitative insights from your team, and also like a layer that's summarizing that and giving you a suggestion on an action plan. And that really helps to tackle the things in the right order that are most important in your company, right? And I think it might be really dependent, depending on the context. Maybe in some companies it's as simple as the people don't have the tools, the software to actually be effective and successful in their role. Maybe in another company there's strategic unclarity. Maybe in another environment maybe there isn't like the managers aren't trained really well, so that sort of trickles down to the team not knowing what to do. It's just like there's no one size fits all, and I think it's just very important that you have all the understanding as to what the biggest levers are for your specific business and what sort of like has the biggest outcome and the biggest impact. And I think interestingly, I think a lot of folks think about survey data as like a people thing. When I look at survey data, I think it's often also like really, really telling where there's a fundamental business problem. So often like really, really low engagement also coincides with we have a strategic issue there, like a strategy is not working out. So I think it's actually really, really interesting, even if you think about a holistic sort of scorecard to steer your business, to have that as one part to actually have a holistic understanding of your business and the biggest levers to actually move the business forward.
So Jenny, as I listen to you, let's kind of take it down to this kind of the lowest common denominator here. Do people really know each other anymore? I mean, do you really think that in these large or medium-sized organizations, I know it's easier at a smaller companies, but do they really know their people, or do they just know their jobs and what they're accountable for? Because, and the reason I ask this question is I think environment building really begins with just knowing who your people are. And what I've learned is that we know people from the moment we first meet them, but we don't take the time to see how people evolve over time because we're not so in touch with who our people are and how we as employers are trying to provide them the tools and support to help them evolve as individuals. So with that context, do you really think that leaders really know their people?
Mm. I think it's an interesting question because I would say, I mean, obviously it gets harder to keep that really, really close connection the bigger an organization goes. At the same time, I think humans have sort of like an innate desire for human connection. And I think also human connection is something that energizes us, it fuels us. So I think it's just like a really important part of who we are as humans, but also like how we work. So I think there's so what I see is it's also quite dependent on the culture of an organization or an organizational culture, to what extent that moving or thinking beyond just an employee to also thinking about the human actually happens and takes place. But I would actually say part of the shift we've seen of the people team moving away from maybe mainly compliance focused unit to also like a more sort of people centric, how do I best partner with the business unit? That this actually is something that thinking in a bit more of a personalized way, actually, a bit more of a way of how do we generate human connection actually does happen. And I think what are ways, tangible ways, how that can be triggered or how that's happening. So I think what we see is in a lot of companies that move to hybrid, we see more departmental team or even all company offsites happening. So like bringing the team together to actually form these human connections, right? That's, I think, one really tangible way of how we can make sure these human connections actually can build. I think other ways we see, I think a lot of companies tend to introduce buddy systems, right? Where you maybe actually have someone that's not even directly related to your functional role that can help you be someone that navigates this new organization or system. And that's kind of like another human face and connection you can build within the organization. And I think it's also something that has become more center stage in manager trainings. And I think managers, again, like, I think it's unrealistic to have a personal relationship as CEO in a big company with everyone, right? But I think you can set the standards, be the role model as to what sort of manager principles you also want to, or leadership principles you want to actually envision or implement in the organization. So, for example, in manager training programs, do you underline the importance of having regular one-on-ones with direct reports, right? Like something, for example, we do internally at Leapsome very, very consistently. Like everyone is expected to have a weekly one-on-one with their direct reports, and in those one-on-ones, it's actually part of our platform also that there's a meeting module where you can actually set agendas and thereby help people also to build these good habits. And we generally always start our one-on-ones with a personal check-in, right? How are you doing? What's going on? Like, is there anything that's kind of preventing you from bringing your full self to work or to doing your best work? Because sometimes these things ultimately matters. Sometimes you need to actually get them out of the way for people to be successful. But I think these are different ways, like offsites, buddy programs, really good routines around one-on-ones that can help sort of by design foster some of these connections and relationships in the workplace.
Well, as I listen to you, it all makes sense, but I'll let this one simmer for a bit. How about the other way around? Instead of you meeting with your leader meets with you. Or in other words, it's not about what my leader thinks of me, but it's about what I think of my leader. And I think this is part of the balance of power shift. We need to start removing hierarchy from these types of programs, because the truth is, and you brought up something, and I'm just going to share this with you. This question, how are you doing today, is asked every single day. And you know that most people feel suppressed when they hear this question because they don't actually want to share the truth. And I'm only sharing this with you, not because I'm asking you to agree, because you don't have to agree with anything I'm saying, but I believe that the challenges that employees are faced with now, and we talk a lot about human and all this, and I think it's really important. But at the end of the day, this is about what really matters to people. And I don't think we're there yet. We think we know who our people are, but we don't really know. And why is that? Because we still allow hierarchy to dictate the rules of engagement, when the truth is what? We're all trying to transform and figure out our way in this time of uncertainty, because no one really knows what's going to happen. Well, wouldn't it make more sense, rather than guess, to really allow the managers to manage their leader for a while? I mean, there's got to be a way where we turn this whole thing upside down a little bit and create a little chaos, because I know it may sound unrealistic, but I know it's not, because I've been and created these environments before. But I just share this because the work that you do is so important. I want you to go deeper into enablement for us, because you spend a lot of time helping a lot of organizations with the retention of their top talent. First of all, what is it that's changed about retention over the last 3 years that maybe employers don't know enough about? But what role does enablement play in this equation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, also maybe one other point I would love to even touch upon,
Go,
based on
take it
sort of
where you
like,
want to
yeah,
go.
yes, maybe two thoughts. I think the first thought, I think it's a really good nudge. Like, should the manager be leading their director to some extent? Like, where does that happen? And I think an interesting way to think about one-on-ones is actually, it's not the sort of like the managers meeting, but it's actually the direct reports meeting. So they can define the agenda. They should get out what they need to be successful in their role out of that meeting, rather than this being a reporting meeting, because I think then that kind of defeats the purpose that you could also do that in an async email, right? So I think this is maybe small mental shift that can, however, be really, really effective and actually getting more into that state that you were sort of like laying out of making sure we turn the thing sort of like around a bit, or disrupt it a bit. And I think the other element that's really, really important to be strategic about and to think about is like, how do we actually create an environment where more honesty and transparency can happen? And I think that's the whole question of how do we build psychological safety in the workplace. How do we generate a true sort of feedback and learning culture? Because I think the companies that are going to be successful in this complex world nowadays are going to be those ones that really have a strong learning and feedback culture, because they can iterate faster, they can outcompete their competitors. So what does it mean, or how do you get there? The two trainings that we actually implemented the earliest and had the sort of mandatory for managers for a long time as an active listening training and a feedback training. And I think a feedback training is actually something that's really, really impactful if you run that with your entire workforce, because we often are really afraid of having the hard conversations or being honest, but ultimately being honest with one another and sort of like having the like really being able to give that feedback and to have an environment where the leaders also ask for the feedback, listen to the hard feedback, action on the hard feedback. I think that's what like is rocket fuel for an organization to be successful upon.
I love it. I love it. So tell me how all this plays into retention of top talent. How has
Yeah.
it changed over the past 3 years?
Yeah. And I mean, I think this is, I think retention is always to some extent a lagging KPI. The
Hmm.
leading KPI is engagement, enablement, like everything we talked about. Like, do we have the alignment piece right? Do we have the organizational context and environment in which people can succeed? Do we build a great employee experience? And where's the gap between what we believe we're doing when it comes to alignment, people experience, environment, and the actual experience of the employees, right? And this is where surveys and data can be so helpful to identify these gaps in perception that we might have as company leadership versus sort of like the front line. And then really being strategic, and you can't change everything at the same time, but focusing on really tackling the most important levers in the right order and actually then measuring if they're actually having the change that you envisioned them to have, right? So it's a bit of a kind of scientific in some ways of like tackling the most important levers and measuring if it actually has the impact. And then high retention is ultimately your success metric or criteria that you see you're actually getting that right. So I think we speak a lot about retention, but ultimately the discussion of retention is a bit after the fact because it's ultimately measuring if we've done our job beforehand effectively.
So as we wrap this up a bit, Jenny, take us out 5 years from now. What do you think is going to be the most challenging and yet opportunistic thing that we can do for our people? I mean, because you have a good pulse on this. What do you see 5 years from now? Are we making much progress, or are the forces of standardization going to still celebrate incrementalism? Like, what do you see?
I mean, I think what I personally see is I think there's a lot of opportunity to further automate some of the more standardized work to actually then focus on really getting the more strategic and personalized element right. And I mean, the main driver for that is, I mean, both relatively dumb automation, but then also like an AI layer. And that really lets us then focus. I mean, in HR departments, for example, there's still a lot of manual work actually done. If we can automate that, we can actually focus a lot more on have we gotten the strategy right? Are we communicating it well? Are we really keeping the organization aligned? How are we training our managers? Like, how do we give the managers like a really good support and assistance to actually be really, really effective in their job? We've shipped a we've AI co-pilot for managers like a few weeks ago that is kind of like a smart coach or assistant that you have at all times. So even ahead of like a hard conversation you have with an employee, you can actually help like have the AI support you and how do you tackle that conversation, maybe helping you find some of the previous data. And just it's a bit of like a rocket fuel to be successful as a manager in your role. And then that way, there's like different sort of like layers of like augmenting us as humans. I don't think humans are going to be like easily replaced by AI across the board. I think it's just we need to learn to use and leverage this technology in our daily work, and that helps us to then focus on really building that alignment, like focusing on the growth, on like really making sure people understand what's expected of them, where they're doing well, where they need to like grow on, being their co-pilot to help them grow, and really using the data and helping us understand it to then actually really build exceptional organizations that are highly aligned, have great employee experiences, but also where we have really that these insights as people leaders, as business leaders to really drive our business success.
So here's a thought I'd love to get your reaction to. I think in the next 5 years, leaders are going to have to be the best coaches in the organization. How do we get leaders to get there? Because the things that you're talking about require unlearning, learning, relearning, repeat. I mean, we're going through a lot of different behavioral, environmental changes, and then you see what's going on in society. I mean, AI can't be our answer. It can be a support partner, But in the end, what's the leader going to do to become a better coach, especially since at least most of them aren't good coaches?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think ultimately, what do coaches do? They ask great questions. They listen really well, and maybe occasionally they provide feedback or trigger certain thoughts. So I think it really comes to, have we learned to actively listen? And have we actually learned to provide feedback, provide praise, maybe at times also have the hard conversations? And I think those are the skills that are really transcending any sort of technological change that we see, that we really need to get right. And I think this is also what we really need to deeply build into our culture. So this goes beyond individuals sort of showing this behavior, but really making sure this is part of the DNA and the organizational cultures we're building. And if we think about how do we actually build this kind of organization and how do we get shift in this direction, I think it's really interesting. I always think about change in 4 dimensions. Are we role models as leaders? Do we really role model this behavior? Do we listen actively? Do we ask for feedback? Do we action on feedback? How do we provide feedback? So really role modeling that to start shifting the organization in that direction. Then also speaking about why this is even important. Like, why does it really matter to have sort of that coaching mindset, to really develop the skill as an organization? How's that actually going to make us more successful at the business? Like, everybody really understanding the why. Also investing into the training, like really making sure everybody, like especially managers, are trained in these skills, active listening, feedback. What does it mean to build a psychologically safe workplace? And then the fourth piece next to the role models, the why, and the training is, do we actually have ways to build good habits? And I think this is where tooling, AI co-pilots can be really powerful to like nudge us to really get into these habits. Like I don't know, running app reminds us to go running and helps us to set the right pace and do the right training to get there. But I think this is ultimately how we change as leaders, how we evolve as leaders, but also how we make sure we systematically and structurally build organizations that are really set up for success in this day and age.
Well, I'll leave you with this. I think listening actively requires us to learn how to listen to difference. But why is it so difficult to listen to difference? Well, when you've been standardized to think a certain way, all you know is sameness. And so when someone gives an appointing point of view, we tend to judge rather than recognize the value in their difference. So I share that with you because I agree. We need to be better listeners and be better coaches. But for goodness sakes, let's start seeing opportunity in difference rather than seeing it as a threat. Any final comments, Jenny, as we wrap it up?
100% agree with that. And I think we learn the most also from difference, right? So I think we should also embrace that learning and challenge our perspectives, widen our perspectives. And yeah, I think that's couldn't have said it better than you did.
Well, Jenny, thank you so much for your time. Keep up the good work and let's stay in touch.
Really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And as we wrap up every show, when you lead in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't. Do what others won't, and keep pushing when prudence says quit. Thanks again for your time, Jenny. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thanks for listening to Personalization Outbreak. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. If you enjoyed the content, visit ageofpersonalization.com to check out our free streaming video series and learn how to get involved in the movement. I'm Glenn Llopis. I wish you a good day, and remember, without strategy, change is merely substitution, not evolution.